In the 1960s, Roger Corman brought Edgar Allan Poe to American International Pictures, a company for which he had quickly become a most valuable player. The vast majority of these films, House of Usher, The Raven, Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, and others, were produced and directed by Corman and starred Vincent Price. So popular were these films that Corman even brought another film to the screen, which was credited as part of this ongoing Poe series, The Haunted Palace. But in fact, that film actually had nothing to do with Poe. It was based on the novella The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P. Lovecraft. Corman returned to Lovecraft by the end of the decade, and this time, the studio was prepared to give Lovecraft his full credit.
The nights are darker. And night is when it happens in the Dunwich Horror.
The Dunwich Horror was first published in 1929, and it went on to become one of Lovecraft's most popular works. Its small-town setting and fantastical scenarios also make it one of the most cinematic. The film tells the story of the Whately family, a sinister and elusive clan that lives in the shadows among the townfolk of Dunwich, Massachusetts. The son, Wilbur, is desperate to get his hands on an ancient book called the Necronomicon, in the hopes of opening a portal to the Old Ones, more specifically, his demon father. Not only will Wilbur need the book to perform this ritual, but he will also require a virginal sacrifice, which he finds in the form of university co-ed Nancy Wagner. During the course of the film, as Nancy is drawn more intently into the hypnotic web of Wilbur and his family, Dr. Henry Armitage desperately races against time to not only stop her ritual sacrifice, but also to save civilization from the conquest of unspeakable evil. Founders of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, Andrew Leman and Sean Branney.
One of the sort of ongoing themes in a lot of Lovecraftian stories is that, there is something behind reality that most people don't know and will never understand.
But Lovecraft's work, too, has a fun kind of plausibility to it.
Right.
If you want to get into Tolkien and, or Game of Thrones or whatever, you just got to buy into a world with dragons and orcs and elves and fully leave your current world behind and check into a new reality. But the Lovecraft world really is our world, maybe how it was 80, 90 years ago, but it's the real world. But as Andrew's saying, just beyond the boundaries of your perception, there's a whole bunch of other secret things going on.
That is interesting that you mentioned that he's kind of exploring the underside or the kind of secret societies that are in plain sight. Because when we are covering these movies of the 70s, we're looking at the culture at the time, and it was really the first time culturally when we felt we're being lied to.
Yeah,
and I think definitely we still live in that mindset now. So that's fascinating.
The film version of the Dunwich Horror strays considerably from the original text written by Lovecraft. Several of these changes were implemented as a means of capitalizing on another hit film of the time.
Were they making a conscious choice to kind of stray away from the classic Gothic style in this movie and go more towards the Rosemary's Baby side?
Yeah, that was absolutely the précis right there. You just said it. That was the conversation.
Writer, producer, and film historian Steve Haberman.
Let's try to make it less like, the Poe films, because there'd been already 8 Poe films from Corman, and, a couple of imitations like Die Monster Die and stuff like that. And Corman wanted to always push the envelope, and he wanted to find a Lovecraft style, perhaps, something that would be different than the Poe films, as Lovecraft is different from Poe. And also, as you said, Rosemary's Baby was an enormous hit in 1968. A horror film from a big studio, from Paramount, directed by, a young genius, Roman Polanski, and, based on a very disturbing piece of contemporary literature, and it made a fortune. So they wanted to hook onto that as well.
It's interesting to me that the kind of the incarnations that Dunwich went through before it was actually put into production. I think originally it might have been helmed by Mario Bava.
Yeah, they were thinking of making a Bava movie out of it in the mid-'60s, and that was to star Boris Karloff, who really liked Bava when they made Black Sabbath together, and Christopher Lee, who had also worked for Bava in Whip and the Body and Hercules in the Haunted World. And, it was going to be called Scarlet Friday, and Bava was going to do it, but Bava was having a rough time at the time. First of all, he had made a dreadful comedy for AIP called Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs, and Vincent Price said he'd never work with him again. And Bava, I think, was having a nervous breakdown at the time, too, so that thing went away. That would have been very interesting, though. But Corman took it, I think, more seriously. Not that Bava didn't take his material seriously, but, Corman is a very serious, very intellectual guy, and he let Daniel Haller, who was his production designer, very talented young production designer, direct it. And he had already directed another Lovecraft film, not for Corman, but for AIP, called, in this country, it was called Die Monster Die. And Daniel Haller doesn't really have a consistent worldview like Corman, but he has Corman's craft because he was the production designer. They spent the nights together on the sets of House of Usher, which was shot in 15 days, which is remarkable for the richness of that film. And they spent the nights on the set that was designed and built by Haller to block out how to shoot the next day. What would Hitchcock do? What would Bergman do? And figure out the moving camera and what to put in front to emphasize the moves and things like that. So he was very, very good visually. And that comes across in Die Monster Die, but it comes across even more so in the Dunwich Horror, because it has a kind of a trippy, hallucinogenic, almost drug-induced feeling to it, with flashbacks that are desaturated with color, and the point of view of mad characters that are solarized, or the moving point of view of the invisible monster in the end. There's a lot of opportunity, and Daniel Haller really grabs it and runs with it, and it's quite memorable that way.
The Dunwich Horror is especially noteworthy for the talent involved. It marked one of the final performances from veteran actor Ed Begley. He passed away only a few months after the film's release.
Let me put it this way, Doctor. The legend of the Necronomicon has it that long ago the Earth was inhabited by a species from another dimension, with certain chants from the book, coupled with ancient rites and sacrifices. This race, the old ones, can be brought back.
Ed Begley had won an Academy Award and a Tony and so on. He's still, to especially horror fans, pretty unknown. And so he becomes Professor Armitage for that movie.
The film also features the first official credit for co-screenwriter Curtis Hanson, the talented writer-director who would later find great acclaim with films including The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, L.A. Confidential, and 8 Mile.
They took the events and sort of spread them out, and again made them naturalistic, made them explainable and much more, believable in a real world context. And I thought that, I know it went through 3, if not 4 writers just for Corman, and I think it ended up Curtis Hanson did the final draft, doing a very, very well structured and skillful presentation of the Lovecraft story of the Dunwich Horror in feature-length context.
For the character of Nancy Wagner, the young woman who becomes Wilbur's prey for sacrifice, Sandra Dee was cast against her typically good girl type. She even appears topless in the film.
Do you remember what we talked about this morning?
Yes.
When you asked me that question about sex?
Yes.
I lied.
I know.
In the book, the lead character of Wilbur is a monstrosity both in psychological and physical form. The filmmaker strayed from this conception when they cast a young Dean Stockwell.
And they placed the girl's virginal body upon the altar, naked to the elements, and their black robes blending into the night. They lighted candles and gathered round to observe and to relish her nakedness. And then they waited. They waited for the moment when she would allow the power of darkness to enter. The moment when the gate would open and the old ones would come through.
Interestingly, Stockwell would later star as Dr. Henry Armitage in the remake of the Dunwich Horror, which was produced as a TV movie in 2009.
It's easy to see why, when you adapt it for a movie, you want to turn Wilbur into a charismatic lead and put Sandra Dee in it, but those things are very much not like the original story. Most Lovecraft fans who know the original story, I think one of the most silly things about the movie is the changes to the Wilbur Whately character and having it be, 5'2" Dean Stockwell with his mustache. When you know the story, you know that that's not what Wilbur's supposed to be like at all. So I think that's part of what makes the movie seem especially goofy to fans of the original story.
Whatever your feelings toward the film as a whole, many of its parts are quite accomplished, including the memorable score from Les Baxter, the evocative imagery designed by Daniel Haller and his team, and the overall feel of the film that makes it relevant to the time in which it was made.
I mean, Lovecraft would have been horrified by the whole hippie movement and stuff like that, but Daniel Haller said, we were hippies making this movie in Mendocino, which was hippie central on the, Northern California coast. And yet the kind of body-painted, naked young people running around terrorizing Sandra Dee in the movie represent, many people get this wrong. They think they're representing the old ones, the gods. That's ridiculous. No, they're representing the cult that worshipped the old ones. So really, I mean, in many ways, Dunwich Horror is an anti-hippie film.
The Dunwich Horror is a divisive film. Some feel its close ties to the time in which it was produced leave it feeling irrevocably dated, and they consider it a disservice to Lovecraft's initial intent. But others feel the film is an overlooked gem of contemporary Gothic horror.
They actually do a thing sometimes called the Dunwich Horror Picture Show, where it'll be, a midnight movie, and people go watch it in order to make fun of it in a loving kind of way.
It's successful on a lot of levels. First of all, visually it's terrific. The locations, the kind of almost avant-garde use of like solarized images, and so I admire that. So I like the way it looks. I like the casting. I like the screenplay. I think Les Baxter's score is terrific. I like the time period. I think it's very interesting that they made this movie in the late 60s when Lovecraft was kind of a countercultural hero. And it's just, there's a lot of good things about that movie.